This is our first session in our annual Autumn Climate Connection Business Webinar Series. My name is Jeff Marks. I'm Climate Work Maine's Executive Director. And just a little bit on our organization. We are businesses and organizations of all sizes and types, providing services and network to support and promote those with products, services, programs, or projects related to climate solutions, and to support and assist those who want to do more on climate change in Maine. We connect businesses to the resources that they need to grow and succeed and do that in a more sustainable economy. I'd like to start right off by thanking Drummond Woodsum for sponsoring this year's webinar series, which will focus on Maine in energy, including renewable energy today, other alternative energy sources later in the fall, and energy efficiency. Today's webinar is also an affiliated event with National Clean Energy Week that is going on this week. I also want to thank some of our members, including our heroes like Bangor Savings Bank, CMP, Hannaford, and Unum. They help us put on these webinars and a lot of other things that we do. Today's session is focused on state and federal incentives for renewable energy projects. Drummond Woodsum's Energy Practice Group Leader Adam Cote will lead an overview of changes to federal tax credits for renewable projects, as well as changes to Maine's net energy billing program and what those changes could mean for your business or your organization. I'll let Adam and Ben from Drummond Woodsum and Christina from Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions tell you a little bit about themselves during their remarks. We really want to make this as interactive as possible, so we urge you to ask questions, and please do that using the question link on your Zoom screen. And I do want to thank Jen Brooks for producing our webinars and making sure that you all see and hear our experts and are able to ask questions. If you're not already a Climate Work Maine member, we'd love to have a conversation with you about what your priorities and activities are and whether there's anything that we can do to help. Just look me up by number or email address on our website. And I'll put in a quick plug in October. On October 17th, we'll be having our second webinar on alternative energy sources that are not talked about today. You'll be getting some more information on that. And I want to kick it over quickly to Sophie on our staff, who will be hosting a Sustainability Council meeting in October. Sophie, can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everybody. I am the Programs and Outreach Manager at Climate Work Maine. And before we dive into today's discussion, I wanted to flag an upcoming opportunity that builds directly off of the themes we'll be talking about today. On Thursday, October 2nd, from 5 to 7 p.m., Climate Work Maine will host its next Sustainability Council meeting at Revision Energy's decarbonization facility in South Portland. For those who are not members or are not sure of it, the Sustainability Council is a forum for business leaders, sustainability professionals, and decision makers from Climate Work Maine member organizations and the general network to connect, share insights, and explore actionable strategies for advancing sustainability initiatives within their organization. This upcoming council meeting will take today's policy conversation and zoom in on what it means in practice for Maine businesses. With rising utility rates and upcoming changes to solar incentives, Phil Coop and Andrew Carl from Revision Energy will guide us through explaining how we assess the return of investment on solar projects moving forward, the current commercial solar landscape, and discuss how companies can reduce energy costs while boosting resilience and sustainability. If today's session raises any questions or sparks ideas, we'd love to continue the conversation with you in person on October 2nd, and I think we'll include some information in that either in the chat or in a follow-up email. With that, I will pass it back over to Jeff.
Sorry, Jeff, you broke up. Were you handing it over to me? Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Jeff, Sophie, Jen, all the folks at Climate Work Maine for hosting this. I also would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the hard work from Adriana Grimes here at Drummond Woodsum, who worked very hard behind the scenes to pull this together and to make sure Christina and Ben and I were staying on task, putting together our materials. When Jeff and I originally talked about doing this, and we were wondering what topic we wanted to cover, I really didn't need to ask a lot of people or think long and hard about it. And primarily that's because I've been working in this space for about 25 years, and there are two bills that have made the most dramatic impact to my practice individually, and I've seen the attendee list here. I know all of you on the call. That would be the Inflation Reduction Act on the federal level, and then the solar and renewable portfolio standards bills that were passed in Maine in 2019. And changes to those bills both of those on the federal and state level have occurred over the last several months. And it's created a lot of uncertainty. It's created a lot of misconceptions and lack of clarity, particularly for projects that are already in midstream. So with that as a backdrop, it seemed like an obvious topic to cover. As Jeff mentioned, I'm head of the energy practice group at Drummond Woodsum. Been practicing in this space for quite a few years. Was thrilled in the last couple of years to have Ben Algio join our practice group. In my view, a rising star in the clean energy space, a great asset to the bar in the state of Maine. And what we were really missing was somebody for this webinar, somebody with really an in the weeds understanding and approach to what happened in Washington with the big beautiful bill. And Jeff, of course, has a broad network, and he said, I know the perfect person. So we're really excited to have Christina join us. Christina is with Citizens for Responsible Solutions, which is lobbying group in DC. If I misstate any of this, Christina, you can correct it, but a lobbying group in DC that really focuses on lobbying Republican members of Congress, Congress and in the House and Senate on clean energy and economy and environmental issues. So I think that's a fascinating thing, because it was many of the Republicans that were the most involved in crafting this, particularly the ones that have a history of supporting clean energy. So she's going to be a great, I think, asset for this. And without further ado, so folks know, we're going to spend the first half talking to Christina about changes to the Inflation Reduction Act, and we'll spend the second half talking to Ben. Towards the end, we'll have some questions. With that as a backdrop, I'm going to sort of jump into it. Very quick Reader's Digest version of the Inflation Reduction Act. As many folks know, there were for a number of years investment tax credits for solar projects, production tax credits for wind projects. And that was always in question every year, whether they would be sunsetted or whether they'd be renewed. The Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 entirely changed the dynamic. It expanded the tax credits. For one, it would be on a base 30%. There were a whole bunch of adders that you could qualify for if you had things like domestic content or energy communities, all these types of things. You could crawl it up. You could use the ITC or the PTC. It wasn't just taxpayers that could get it. Nonprofits, municipalities, tribes could have a direct pay option. There was a transferability option. The point is, it was significant in the energy space. So fast forward to the elections, and President Trump gets elected. All sorts of discussion of changes that the Trump administration is going to do. And those of us that worked in this space, myself included, spent a lot of time wondering if and what changes could or would occur to the Inflation Reduction Act. And a lot of folks thought that there would not be, or there was a pretty decent chance that there wouldn't really be changes to the Inflation Reduction Act, at least initially, because it didn't seem to be one of the top focuses of discussion, but also because so many red state, Republican states were benefiting from these tax credits. So it seemed like there wouldn't be. And then we got into this sort of crisis mode a few months ago when the Big Beautiful Bill language starts coming out, and it had some really significant changes to the Inflation Reduction Act. And it, from what I could tell from the state of Maine and internet, just looking from afar, it seemed like there were some really back and forth discussions going on there. And in many ways, we're still sort of trying to figure out what all of this means. So with that as a very long introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Christina, who knows a lot more about this. And Christina, what was it like down in DC? How did it start out? What did you feel going in, and walk us through that experience?
Yeah, so I guess probably the best way to start is actually last summer, before we actually knew that Trump would win the presidency, and when we were still wondering whether or not, it could be, President Biden, President, I guess, Harris, or President Trump again. And so with just the uncertainty, we worked with some of our friends and allies to kind of start bolstering support for energy tax credits. Obviously, last summer, you saw a letter led by Representative Andrew Garbarino. You had about 21 House Republican members say, hey, like, not so fast. I know we all voted to not pass the Inflation Reduction Act, but we also know that these are delivering benefits inside of our states. So essentially what happened was, it was kind of like let's see if we can get more towards a scalpel approach in terms of, piecemealing whether or not we should continue some of these, incentives or not. So, fall comes, President Trump wins, they then send another letter. And you have even more Republicans say, hey, like, I get it, you don't like this stuff, but we need to really be thoughtful here because they have very large investment impacts, and businesses are relying on business continuity, having incentive certainty. And if you take the rug away too fast, it's really going to impact jobs. So President Trump is inaugurated. They start thinking about a big, beautiful bill. And essentially, the question comes, how can we reduce cost? Because the House Freedom Caucus and some of the more fiscal conservative members in the US House are saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with the cost of TCJI. I'm not comfortable with cost of like all these big major priorities the president wants done. And so what happened was, it really created a tension between different things that cost a lot of money. So they saw the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits as something that was very expensive and could be cut down in order to find savings for other things that they liked, like the extension of the Tax Tops of Drugs Act, or the tax on tips measures. And so you had kind of some conflict groups approach. And one of them was the SALT issue, which, if you live in a state where you pay a lot of money in state and local income taxes, SALT's a big deal to you. It's, also states that tend to be wealthier, so they pay more money federally. And so, that was one big camp of conflict. The second camp, I'll say, is the SNAP and Medicaid. So people don't like Medicaid benefits cut. They don't like SNAP benefits cut. They think that, those are, two very good things that the federal government spends money on, and it puts them in a very bad position back home, because you have to say, well, why are people not being fed? Why are people not getting health care? The third camp, which was essentially the tax credit camp, was the folks who are like, we need to be recycling capital faster in order to make all the AI demand. And so those three camps are all kind of fighting for similar dollars and funds. And when the top line number of this bill went down, all three of those buckets kind of became in a place where, they were all finding, dollars and cent savings. So the House moved first, and people at the time were saying this is as bad as it could get. And that was before they figured out, hey, we have like some of these like top line issues where, we're all trying to find dollars and cents. We're all trying to find pay-fors. And so when it went over to the Senate, people were very shocked when they saw the Senate finance bill being slightly better, but really not being as good as folks were hoping. I think a lot of the members who signed the Garbarino letter, but also, we had enough senators saying, hey, like, don't, axe these all out. that they were actually fairly shocked that the marks that came in the Senate were not substantially better. So, during the Senate sausage making process, as I think you were calling it, sausage making, Adam, the first bill that dropped was slightly better than the House, but then the second bill we saw was much worse than the House. We actually saw an excise tax put in. We saw some cuts in there that would have been very, very punitive to wind and solar, even ones that weren't using the tax credits. But then by the end process, the excise tax was removed. You still had things like transferability preserved, but you had very restrictive foreign entity of concern provisions inside of it. And, it's definitely something that is a process that should have taken a lot more time, right? We're writing very complicated tax policy, and they are making substantial decisions in the course of a weekend. They are trying to create amendments in the course of a weekend. They're trying to bolster enough support in the course of a weekend because President Trump said July 4th. And so some things that probably would have taken a little bit of time and be maybe written a little bit more effectively, you just ran out of time. And so the product that we got was essentially one where, if we just look at the top line dollar of what was an incentive in the Inflation Reduction Act versus what was in, I call it OB3 because the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is a lot off the mouth. What was in OB3 was definitely more than it was just about half of what was in the Inflation Reduction Act originally. So if I think about it a whole year prior, every Republican voted against, the Inflation Reduction Act, but also every Republican was in favor of repealing all of these completely a year prior for that July 4th vote. So in the course of the year, the fact that you're able to kind of swage it so that half continue to survive, if you think it's good or bad, I guess it's the same as if you're a glass half full, glass half empty person. But I would just say the fact that we're talking about it today and it's not completely removed does show that there was a lot of advocacy and people understanding that these incentives do matter.
Yeah, and as we get to the dust settling, if we could categorize it, if putting in the solar, for example, for residential rooftop, you're going to put a solar panel on your roof for your home. You've got till December 31st to have that in, correct?
So for residential solar, so they put different rules in for different technologies, which is definitely frustrating. But yes, residential solar is the first one that essentially has an issue because it's under the 25D credit.
Yeah.
And so 25D is, that was one that was sunset much more aggressively than others. But I would just say that, like, even though December feels very, very fast, I would just say that the trade associations worked very hard to get that December date. Remember when I'm talking about that upward pressure on the budget? There were proposals, especially on the House side, that would have had it the date of introduction, which would have been in May. So it would have actually been turned off overnight.
And then when we get to the commercial, where we have, I presume, a lot of the folks that are on this
Yes.
webinar, I get a lot of questions on the safe harbor. When do I need to begin construction? When do I need to conclude construction? How do I qualify? How does this affect my existing agreements? How do we need to revise it? Could you summarize the best that you can on the construction qualifying for tax credits for a commercial type solar project? What have we found out for answers? What has been defined and what is still sort of murky with respect to IRS guidance? Making the, as you mentioned yesterday during our call, which I should have done in the beginning, none of us are tax attorneys on this, right? So we're speaking at a level. Yeah.
Nothing I say should be considered tax advice. And
Right.
although I sometimes play a lawyer and a tax expert on TV, I am neither of those two things. So the first thing I would always say is hire people smarter than you who can be used to actually give you a decision that you should be using for, billions of dollars of investments, right? I don't know, Adam, am I able to drop links into the chat? Is that working or?
That's a
Um,
Jen or Jeff question.
Okay, that's fine. So the short answer is, and I guess I'll start with just overarchingly like the timeline shifts. The Section 45Y tax credit, they split off wind and solar from it. So if you're a wind and solar project, you have different rules than if you're like geothermal or nuclear or batteries. So for wind and solar facilities that begin construction 12 months after enactment, they have to be placed in service essentially by like December 31st, 2027. So the short answer is that you do have about 2 years to potentially get things. You also have new rules that have been added, right? So you have to now consider the foreign entity of concern rules. And the FIOC rules are things that we don't actually have guidance from Treasury yet on. We have a two things that you're going to have to start thinking about, which are essentially, like, for folks who are not super familiar with what a foreign entity of concern is, it's, does China own your company, or does someone who's like a terrorist group own your company, and are you trying to get tax credits? Like, that's philosophically what they're getting at. But in practice, it's who's on your board, who owns control of your company, and are they able to kind of take the IP back to another country that we're not friendly with. And so those rules are confusing at best. And so we're still waiting for Treasury to offer guidance on, what we consider the, what is a specified foreign entity? Like, who is that foreign entity of concern? And then the second piece that we're trying to still figure out is essentially like the manufacturing side. So that would be what I would consider more of like what folks traditionally call like domestic content, or like how much of your supply chain is domestically made, and to the subcomponent and component level, which, if you can understand that, you're the 1% of all lawyers and you're very, very smart. So I won't bore people, but those are like those two pieces that if you're not thinking about those strategically and making sure that you're compliant with, it's going to start impacting whether or not you're building at risk or not. So September 4th was a date where, you have these rules start to come into place. And so we're still waiting for the foreign entity of concern restrictions. However, we did get changes to the beginning of construction requirements. So traditionally, we had the ability to essentially have a 5% safe harbor for wind and solar facilities that were bigger than about 1.5 megawatts. So instead, what they did was they essentially like shifted towards a physical construction test. And the political reason for why they did that was essentially there were a lot of companies who were calling the White House and saying people are buying a transformer, and then they're saying that they're now safe harbored. And whether or not that's true, legal, or correct, it was a political thing that kind of emboldened the House Freedom Caucus to say, hey, I don't like that. I don't like that they're buying a transformer and then they're saying that they don't have to do these new domestic content requirements. And so the House Freedom Caucus was pressing for very, very restrictive rules. And the senators who have been around a little bit longer, as I like to say, they're a little bit more seasoned, a little bit more reasonable, level-headed folks. They said that that's not what the intent of commenced construction is. Commenced construction is a definition we've had a long time. Placed in service is a definition we've had for a long time. They really didn't want to kind of change the meaning there. And so there's, a little bit of conflict when they created guidance earlier this month. And again, like, it wasn't as bad as folks were saying, but it wasn't as good as kind of the status quo of the existing definitions for commenced construction. So if you're not used to the physical work tests and things like that, I'll make sure to kind of share this nice little summary. And, if it doesn't show up during this chat, it can always be an email handout afterwards, but this was probably the simplest explanation that I have found to date. And take a read of it, because as much as I would love to teach every single person physical tests, it would be painful and incredibly boring, as opposed to just, sharing a document.
Yeah, and that'd be a good time for me to add that Jeff sent me a note that said, hey, just so you could pass along to all the folks listening in, they're going to be sending a follow-up email to all the registrants which will include additional info and link to information. I know Ben has a PowerPoint that he's going to go through probably pretty quickly here. There'll be a copy of that. There'll be a copy of Christina's references. So I don't think people need to worry about not being able to get follow-up. But Christina, if you could kind of summarize, I remember when you and I talked yesterday, you said, what we really always strive to do as lobbyists working in this space is to create some business certainty. And if you could spend some time talking about where you think we are with respect to business certainty, is what's still left unanswered, what may be addressed in a follow-up session? Are we in an area of calm, if you dare? In this climate, I recognize that's the most loaded, impossible to answer question, but I wanted to give you some time to talk about the issue of business certainty. Folks that work in this space, can we, what's left unanswered still? Where are we in the process? Do you think there's a lot more to do, or do you think this is the lay of the land in the clean energy space for the next several years?
Yeah, so I guess let's start with tax and then I'll go to opportunities. Maybe that's the best and most fun way. So from a tax perspective, Treasury will start putting out some guidance. They might do some specific guidance. And so that I think is definitely something that creates a little bit of uncertainty, but like from a tax perspective, you're always able to ask questions to IRS. You're always able to ask clarifying questions. So like if you really feel completely uncertain, you are able to like call the manager, if that makes sense. You might not get an answer from the manager you want. Let me just make sure you're aware of that. But I would just say that, the big outlier thing that's going to impact folks is indeed the FIOC requirements. And then in terms of business certainty, I think the thing that I'm most excited about is there's a lot of momentum right now for permitting reform. And all of these projects, every clean energy project, they are being slowed by interconnection queues. They're being slowed by transmission. They're being slowed by NEPA. They're being slowed by, all of these different things. And so I do see an opportunity, especially at the federal level, to potentially streamline these and make it easier for folks to get a permit, have the permit mean something, and be able to, build and deploy a project to fruition. The third thing that I would just say from like a business certainty perspective is because transferability was maintained, because direct pay was maintained, the equity markets are still functioning, which is very good for business certainty. And to my knowledge, those are still going, which is great. So businesses are investing. I think macro projects, folks, especially in the first 6 months of this year, were very slow to doing major deals and investments because of, the tariffs and trade, things like that. I think that is still kind of going to be the trend until we get kind of into a more stable, we figured it out. Like we've gone through this big transition from one administration to another, which, by the way, when we have a new president, investments all kind of go a little bit crazy for the first year. So, I think from a capital deployment perspective, we probably are getting towards a little bit of a calmer time where we see things like shake out. Like, as I say, if I know something's dead, I'm not going to throw money at it. But if things were maybe in the life support and we've seen them actually continue to live, people start thinking about those investments again. And I think when we talk about just like the sheer need of demand from AI, projects that weren't economically competitive before the tax credits might be competitive even without them. So that does make me feel a lot better, especially as we just think about growth in general. As I sadly say sometimes, like the day of the cheap electron is kind of over. But making sure the electrons are still affordable, I think, is definitely the priority of the day. And, rooftop solar and batteries, like they're going to become more and more cost competitive as the industry gets costs down. So, this is not an optimal outcome, but like, I don't really worry about this technology still deploying at scale.
Oh, that's very helpful to hear. I think I do think you're right. Business certainty is such an important aspect of it, and we touched upon this a little bit when we were talking yesterday, but I go to a conference every year in Phoenix. Infocast puts it on, and it's clean energy conference, mostly for wind and solar. And there was sort of a panic in the room. They have folks in the finance, everything, developers, a who's who in the clean energy space. There was a little bit of a panic because it was the first time when nobody from the government showed up to speak. Usually it'd be the, Department of Energy, somebody with the clean energy tax credits. We had the IRS folks there one year to describe the transferability provisions, et cetera, et cetera. And there really wasn't anybody. And it's little things like that where the I wonder what they're going to do type thing creates some anxiety, particularly for folks that are in midstream in a project or planning to do a project. But I think you're right. I'm sort of feeling within the industry that getting some understanding, get our arms around these changes to it, having sunset provisions put in there, having timelines set up so we can establish definitions of what it means to start or end construction, PTO, that sort of thing is important. So thank you so much, Christina. As I mentioned to folks that are watching, Christina has some materials she's going to include that which should be good references so you can digest slower all
They're
the
nice, organized charts, which
beautiful.
I know I love a nice organized chart. And it shows what changed, which, that's usually very helpful for tax people.
Yeah, and those of us that like pictures, it's perfect. So with that, thank you. Christina's going to stay on. We'll try to get to some questions towards the end, and she may jump in again. But we're going to transition now over to Ben. So you've just gotten the federal overview, and here's the state. I'll do the same thing I did with Christina and give a quick overview. Net energy billing has gotten a lot of press in the last several years in Maine, but the reality is it's been in existence for a really long time, and it traditionally was the typical situation where somebody would put a solar panel on their home and they would get a credit on their bill to have that power on there. But there was a lot of solar development, in particular solar, throughout the country in the early 2000s during the Obama administration and otherwise. And Maine didn't really participate as much in that as many other states had done. So when Governor Mills came in 2019 with the Democratic legislature, there was a big push to quote unquote catch up on things like distributed generation, which is, under 5 megawatt type projects. So two bills came out in 2019. One really expanded net energy billing program so that it wasn't just the rooftop home. It expanded to much larger projects. Commercial projects could get involved. And also we expanded the renewable portfolio standard, which really opened the door for lots of projects. And of course, like many other incentives that occur, the government says, well, there's a little bit too much development going on. We've got to scale it back. So different legislatures have come in and scaled down the timeline, the requirements for qualifying for these incentives. And that culminated, or perhaps culminated, in this last session with LD 1777, which it appears maybe the last change to net energy billing, although I don't want to pretend I have a crystal ball. But Ben's going to talk about that evolution and how we got here and what we did. So Ben, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of walk everybody through the state of play for net energy billing and clean energy incentives in Maine.
Right on. Thanks, Adam. And I have a couple slides to follow along here, just so you can kind of see how things work. So yeah, as Adam was getting at, this last legislative session that kicked off in January of this year was pretty consequential on the renewable energy front. And what we saw was a legislature make changes to two of the kind of marquee renewable energy programs in Maine. So the first that Adam was talking about, the net energy billing program, the legislature definitely rolled that back a little bit, and made a bunch of changes in LD 1777. The other is the renewable portfolio standard, which, if we have time, I'll get into a little bit. But there were some changes there too that are a little less immediate. They're kicking in at around 2030 and then thereafter. So just to sort of set the table a little bit on net energy billing and what this program is, and I think it's important to understand a few facets of this program to understand what the legislature did this year. So as Adam was mentioning, this program has been around since about the 1980s, and in its first iterations, what it really was a program that allowed very small renewable generators to participate in the energy market. And so we're talking like you're somebody putting a couple of panels on the roof of their house, and everything is sort of connected, what we call behind the meter. So the panels feed the load in the house, and if the house doesn't have an energy demand, but the panels are generating, then they export power into the grid. So that's the sort of model up here that you see. Everything's what we call behind the meter. That is how it worked until about 2009, and then the legislature came in and said, we want you to expand this program, PUC. We want you to grow this out into something bigger that more people can participate in. And so that's when we get this concept called virtual net energy billing and the sort of front of the meter model. And so the front of the meter model, you have a project that isn't interconnected behind a meter. It's just, out probably in a field somewhere, or in a kind of a standalone project, and every kilowatt hour that the project generates just goes right onto the grid. It doesn't feed anything behind the meter. And then it has, in its earliest versions, up to 10 customers subscribe to the project, and each customer gets a 1-for-1 credit on their bill. So every kilowatt hour that the project generates is a credit for these customers, and at the end of the month they get a discount on their bill, or they can even carry over credits into the next month. So that's the sort of front of the meter model versus the traditional behind the meter model that really kicked off in 2009. But as Adam mentioned, I mean, this program still wasn't a ton of uptake until 2019, when the legislature came back and said, okay, we really want to ramp this up. And so they raised the size cap from 660 kilowatts to 5 megawatts. So if you think, I think the figure, a megawatt is about 4 acres. So a 5 megawatt project would be about 20 to 25 acres in size. So it's much bigger projects that could participate. They got rid of the cap on the number of customers who can participate in a single project. So an unlimited number of customers can get bill credits from a single project. And the other thing that they created, which I think is really important for today's discussion on LD 1777 and for the business community in general, is this tariff rate option. And to go a little into the weeds on what the tariff rate option is, it's so a lot of commercial industrial customers are billed, instead of on a per kilowatt hour basis, they're billed on a demand basis, or they have a lot of fixed charges on their bill. And so the traditional net energy billing model that was a 1-for-1 kilowatt hour credit was not super beneficial to those customers. So the tariff rate option basically says the Public Utilities Commission is going to come up with a rate that's set by a formula. And for each kilowatt hour that a tariff rate project generates, that's a bill credit against a commercial or industrial customer's bill, and it's against all of the charges, not just the kilowatt hour charges. And as it was originally designed, it sort of tracks the price of electricity in the state for, I think, the smallest class of commercial customers. And so as the price of electricity changes, the bill credit rate under this tariff rate changes as well, which is also how it works under the kilowatt hour program, of course, but this is more set by a formula. So these changes kicked off, and it worked really well, and maybe too well. And so what we had is a huge deluge of project development and kind of bubbling concerns that this program is costing ratepayers too much. And there's some sort of complicated economic arguments about this, but basically the idea is, customers who aren't participating in net energy billing are subsidizing customers who are, and there are a lot of arguments about how much that subsidy is and whether it's justified, but nonetheless, the concerns were there. And so the legislature started to sort of peel this back a little bit. And they said, okay, 5 megawatts is too much. Let's bring it down to 2 megawatts and then down to 1 megawatt. And they had a bunch of kind of safe harbor grandfathering provisions in there that said, if you're online by the end of 2024, if you have your interconnection agreement signed by an earlier date, then you can fall under these higher size caps. But if not, you're out of luck. And the other thing the legislature did in this sort of rollback period is they set a new, what we'll call the alternative tariff rate. So the tariff rate as it was originally established, remember, is connected to the price of electricity. So it fluctuates with the price of electricity. And in this period, the price of electricity did one thing. It went up. And so that tariff rate got really high. And so the legislature said, we need to decouple this a little bit. And they established the alternative tariff rate, which says you're locked in sort of at 2020 prices. We're going to give you a 2.25% escalator every year. So it's going to go up kind of in a linear fashion instead of a sort of, faster than linear, whatever the word is. I didn't do well in math in school. So that's kind of the state of play as we get into this coming session. You have this robust program that's really been kind of pared back, and you have these nascent concerns about cost, and those concerns kind of didn't go away. And so we have the result of that is, and this is just a little bit of a discussion of difference between the original tariff rate, the alternative tariff rate, which I'll get back into in a second. But what the legislature did is they said, we need to make some bigger changes to this. And so they came up with LD 1777. And LD 1777 does a lot of different things, but I think there are 3 kind of big changes, and that's what's on this slide here. So I'm just going to go through these one by one. The first is for new projects that are following that front of the meter model. So remember, this is the solar panel out in the field, putting power onto the grid, and the subscribers are off site. They're getting rid of this program for new front of the meter projects, and it's not an immediate cutoff. They think they have to have a net energy billing agreement signed with the utility by the end of this year, and that's a fairly early step in the development process. So I think we will continue to see some new front of the meter projects for a little while. But along with that change, the legislature also said we need to figure out what to do in the future for these projects, and so they gave a directive to the governor's energy office, which is now going to be called the Department of Energy Resources, that we want you to come up with a proposal to replace this front of the meter program. And so they have until September 30th, 2026 to do that. And then the PUC has 120 days to approve or reject. So we're looking at probably, late next year, early 2027 for a successor program for front of the meter projects. So that's the first big change, the front of the meter project, the new front of the meter projects. The other 2 changes apply to existing projects, and this was, I think, a little controversial. But so the first change is for all, again, front of the meter projects that aren't participating in that tariff rate program and that have multiple off-takers. The legislature said that these projects need to be assessed a project charge, so a sort of I guess a tax maybe is the way to say it. It's a fee that's assessed against these projects. And I thought it was really interesting the way they set this up. So they decided, instead of having it be like a flat rate for all projects, they're going to charge larger projects more per kilowatt, and then medium-sized projects a little less. And then, at least as the bill is written, or the law is in effect now, projects under a megawatt have a $0 fee. But they're still listed in the statute, which I think is really interesting. So these larger projects, $6 a kilowatt a month, that's pretty substantial. If you think about 5 megawatt project, I think that's $30,000 a month, $360,000 a year. That's a pretty large amount of money. And the idea is that these fees are going to sort of cover some of the costs that cost shifting that had been a concern in previous years, have the projects bear that cost instead of have ratepayers bear that cost. The kind of interesting caveat on this is that the commission has to come back and sort of look at those costs at the end of the year and look at the fees and say, is this enough? Is it covering these costs? And so they come back and adjust it. They can't adjust it more than 2.25% per year. Query whether they can, start charging a fee against projects under 1 megawatt. I think it's not super clear from the bill if they can raise that from 0 to, say, some other number, or if they have to sort of keep this structure that the legislature set out. I think that's going to be kind of a question of the commission's discretion. And then there's an exemption to this too. So projects that are wholly owned by their off-takers or owned by a cooperative corporation are exempt, even if they, are over 1 megawatt. So again, I think you'll see maybe some interesting kind of some business structures that might be able to get around this. So front of the meter projects, new front of the meter projects, the program's going away. Existing front of the meter kilowatt hour projects, the program is staying, but there's a new fee. And then we have these commercial and industrial projects. And to just kind of back up a little bit here, I was talking about the original tariff rate and the alternative tariff rate. So the way the law was structured before LD 1777, the original tariff rate, which is the one that's tied to electricity prices and so is going up and going up and going up. That's available for projects that began construction before September 1, 2022, or are co-located with one of their customers that has a majority of their output, and for projects that are under 1 megawatt. And so you have these projects that are getting a really good rate, and then you have the alternative tariff rate projects that are getting, it's a pretty substantially lower rate. So this is from the Public Utilities Commission website. And you can see this top box here is the original tariff rate, the value of the credits under the original tariff rate, and the bottom box is under the alternative tariff rate. And so for example, the small commercial class in the CMP service territory, it's 20 cents per kilowatt hour under the original rate, and it's 13 cents or about 14 cents under the alternative. So it's about a 30% decrease. And so what the legislature did in LD 1777 was, okay, we're gonna cap this original tariff rate. We kind of can't let this keep going on. So again, they sort of broke this up by project size. So projects under 3 megawatts are just kind of stuck at the 2025 rate with that 2.25% escalator. So they're, instead of doing this, they're going to start kind of doing this. And then projects that are over 3 megawatts are bumped down onto the alternative tariff rate. And so that, again, we're talking about existing projects that were kind of built with the expectation that they're going to be on the original tariff rate, now being bumped into that alternative tariff rate, which is much lower. And so the value of the kilowatt hours generated by those projects is going to go down. And so looking at this kind of from a high level, what the legislature seems to be doing is saying, there's some benefits to this virtual NEB model, but we kind of want to make sure that this NEB program is really supporting the types of projects that it was originally intended to support. So the small rooftop projects, behind the meter projects, projects under 1 megawatt, that category of projects is generally going to be okay under this change in law. It's the bigger projects, the front of the meter projects, that are either going to be penalized or lose their eligibility. So projects in the pipeline will lose their eligibility. And so I think that's what the legislature is doing, is sort of saying, the really big program, we kind of need to pare it down a little bit and make it just for the smaller projects. Adam, I just want to kick back to you for a second. How are we doing on time?
We'll get into the RPS piece in a second. I just wanted to, this isn't an opinion webinar, but I think it's helpful to inject some discussion on some of this sometimes. I think that Ben rightfully pointed out the monthly project charge, I think, is going to get a lot more attention. I have heard from and represent a number of developers, obviously have had a lot of problems with this. And I think it's a bit of a lesson to the legislature going forward, perhaps. And I think it's getting back to the discussions we had with Christina regarding business certainty. A lot of these businesses, they don't fully fund their own projects, right? They need to go to a third party lender. They need to have projections on what the project is going to cost, what it's going to produce for revenue. And when a lot of these things change, particularly as dramatically as they are, you either have an as-built project, you have a project in development. It changes a lot of that, particularly when you have it applying to existing projects, and that wasn't anticipated. So I think we're going to hear a lot more about that. I would not be surprised to see a form of docket from the associations, et cetera, asking for the PUC to sort some of this out and to figure out what is a reasonable glide path. And it's the constant tension in our industry between what are reasonable and appropriate rates for ratepayers to pay and what is a proper incentive for a developer to enter the market, to be encouraged to work on a development of a project, and then to have some certainty that that is that's what they're going to get for a rate of return, regardless of what it is. You want to go in there knowing what the rules are. So I think we're going to hear a lot more on that going forward. I suspect the Public Utilities Commission, a lot of this is going to fall on them, and perhaps that's the appropriate place. That's what they do. This is a space that they understand very well. So with that, we're going to transfer over to the RPS standard. Ben, we've had some changes in that, and you're going to do a historical approach on that as well.
Very, very quickly, because I know we're starting to get towards our time here, but just the renewable portfolio standard has been in place for a long time, and was really bumped up in 2019. But what it basically does at a very high level is say if you are a company that's providing power supply in Maine, you have to source a certain amount of that power supply from renewable sources, and there's sort of a sliding scale, and there's sort of different subcategories of renewable resources that they have to provide. And it starts at 31% 2008, and before this session ended at 84% in 2030, and then was sort of flat after that. So that's what this graph is showing. You have the sort of slow increase over the 2020s, and then sort of flat. And the other thing that the law that enacted the RPS did was say, by 2050, we're going to be carbon neutral. And it didn't really say how that was going to happen. And so I think what the legislature did this session was say, okay, let's figure that out. Let's figure out how we're going to make this requirement 100% renewable. And so they passed LD 1868, which does two things. It increases the requirement for Class 1A resources. So this is new renewable resources under 100 megawatts by 1% a year from 2030 to 2040. So where that had been flat over that period before, and then it creates this new Class 3 requirement, which is, I think, really interesting and modeled a little bit after some of the provisions in the IRA in that it's technology neutral. So it says, it explicitly allows nuclear power plants, and then it says anybody else can participate as long as they can prove to the Department of Energy Resources that they are carbon neutral. And so that's a new requirement. It's a new standard that kicks off in 2030, and it will be about 10% of the mix by 2040. And so just, if you're looking to Adam's point, what the future brings for projects in Maine, I think if you're developing a very large renewable energy facility, or if you're putting small solar panels on your house, or developing a pretty small distributed resource, the path is pretty clear. The larger facilities have the economies of scale. They can participate in the wholesale market, and they have that sort of RPS booster there that allows them to pencil out where other projects might not be able to. The smallest projects, net energy billing is still there, and it's still pretty generous for the smaller projects. And to Christina's point, the economies of scale are getting better for these projects. So I think that we will continue to see some growth there. But the big question, of course, is, they rely on tax credits, and what does that mean? The big question mark is those projects that are too big to participate in net energy billing, but don't really have the economies of scale to sell wholesale power. And I think the big takeaway on that is that the ball is in the Department of Energy Resources court and the PUC's court to come up with something to support those projects. And so, I'm confident that those decisions are not going to be made in a vacuum. They are definitely going to be made with input from developers, from the business community, from ratepayers. And so I would definitely encourage anybody who has an interest and a stake in this to reach out and make sure that they hear from you. So yeah, that's my piece.
Oh, it's fantastic, Ben. Thank you. So that concludes our very quick overview. I'm going to hand it back to Jeff in a little bit, but Christina, thank you so much for joining us. Having your insight at the federal level is pretty rare on a lot of these local discussions, but it's important to understand that. And Ben, thank you for taking the time to put this together. I want to thank the folks at Climate Work Maine, Jeff, Sophie, Jen for putting this together. Adriana, thanks again for all your hard work. With that, Jeff, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Ben, thanks, Adam. Thanks, Christina, for today. I'm actually not seeing any questions, but we're coming up on that noon hour, so I appreciate the input here. As Adam mentioned earlier, we're going to put together a follow-up email probably sometime next week. It will have the video presentation and any additional information that our presenters today want to hand over. And as Sophie mentioned at the beginning, we would like to continue the conversation in person at Revision Energy on October 2nd. So please check our website or let me know if you need information and I'll send that out to you. There is one question that came up, so why don't we end with an audience question? I don't know if you can see this, Ben and Adam, but if you want to take a look.
Yeah.
We'll end it with an audience answer.
So the question is that there's a discussion that the next Maine legislative session needs to clarify NEB rules for smaller projects, and I'm actually not familiar with that discussion. I don't know necessarily what they're getting at. I mean, I know the program has changed a lot if you think about the timeline from the early years to 2019, and then this sort of period of rollback. And so I think a lot of the rules were written in 2019. When there were a lot larger projects that qualify. And so I wouldn't be surprised if either the PUC or the legislature is thinking about ways to kind of fix their rules to accommodate what the program has become versus what it was when they wrote their rules in 2019. But I don't have any specific insight on that.
And one other quick thing was on the discrete electric generating facility rules as to essentially it's a rule that says projects can only be a certain size. And you can't have two projects next to each other that are really the same project to try to meet the caps. There's been some matters before the Public Utilities Commission. Ben and I are actually involved in a matter on that, which kind of clarifies or hopes to clarify what one project is versus multiple projects. And I could see that if it doesn't get clarified at the Public Utilities Commission, needing some legislative clarity that's applied to it. But other than that, I agree with Ben.
Well, good. It's 12 o'clock. Time for lunch. It's a beautiful day in Maine. Thank you all for participating in this. Thank you to Drummond Woodsum for sponsoring, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at the October 2nd meeting and on our next webinar a couple of weeks later on October 17th. So thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yes.